Listen, Angel, if you ever touch a real stick, I'll personally call the medics. Laughter ripped across the scorching Arizona flight line, mixing with the roar of jet engines. Staff Sergeant Marina Solis, the smallest on Redstone Airbase, lay half-buried beneath an FA-18 Hornet. Oil smeared her sleeves, sweat streaked her face, but her wrench kept turning as insults rained down. Hangar rat, dream pilot, only fit to Polish cockpits. They didn't know the next voice cleared from the tower would be hers. Falcon-12, you're cleared to land, and when it came, it would save a life and shatter every unspoken rule. This is Veteranbiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The sun hung like a cruel overseer above Redstone Airbase, baking the Arizona tarmac into a shimmering haze. Heat rose in visible waves, distorting the outlines of the Hornets lined up for the afternoon cycle. The flight line smelled of hot metal, scorched rubber, and jet fuel, a cocktail that clung to skin, hair, and clothing until even the shower couldn't fully erase it. To the side of the main strip, a loose semicircle of pilots lounged in the shade of a hangar's corrugated wall. Helmets hung from fingertips, flight suits half-zipped, their conversation peppered with smirks and sidelong glances toward the single figure under the belly of Hornet 302. Captain Doyle, tall, sandy-haired, and perpetually wearing the expression of a man certain of his own place at the top of the food chain, tapped his soda can against his thigh. "All right, gentlemen, bets on the table. A month's pay, says Solis, will never hear her call sign on tower comms. Not unless it's to fetch coffee for whoever's actually flying." The chuckles that followed were hollow, thin in the heavy air. No one in the circle stepped forward to argue. A few shifted uncomfortably, eyes skimming over the deck instead of meeting hers, but their silence was assent. Under the Hornet's fuselage, Marina kept her head down, forearms flexing with the steady torque of her wrench. She was 26, 5 feet tall, with a build that disappeared in the shadow of the airframe. Grease streaked the backs of her hands. Her forearms bore faint nicks and scars, each a story written in tools and metal. She listened to the bet without a word, jaw tightening only once before the rhythm of her work resumed. The soundscape around her was layered. Distant turbine howl, the high whine of a taxiing jet, the occasional clang of dropped tools, but she filtered it, focusing on the tactile conversation between her fingers and the actuator housing. This was her territory. She didn't need to win arguments here. She needed to make sure the machine in front of her could survive whatever the next pilot demanded from it. A shift in the background noise drew her attention, the precise, deliberate crunch of high Polish Oxfords on gravel. It was a sound out of sync with the rest of the flight line, not the shuffling of tech boots or the lazy scuff of a pilot killing time. It carried authority and scrutiny. Colonel Brackett came into view like a shadow cutting across the tarmac. Early 50s, hair clipped to regulation perfection, uniform pressed so sharp it might draw blood. He scanned the flight line with an expression that measured everything and valued little beyond his own standards. His gaze landed on Hornet 302, then dropped to the figure beneath it. Marina slid out on her creeper, rising to attention in one smooth motion. Sweat tracked the line of her temple, but her eyes stayed locked on his. "And you are?" His tone was flat, as if reading an inventory tag on a misplaced part. "Staff Sergeant Solis, Colonel," she answered, voice steady. Brackett let the silence hang for a beat too long. "Staff Sergeant Solis," he repeated, tasting the syllables like they might reveal something about her. "Why is someone like you working on critical systems for an FA-18? This isn't a motorcycle repair bay." The barb landed with surgical precision. Around them, conversation stuttered and died. "I'm the lead technician on this airframe, sir, running a post-flush check on the flap actuator system." Her delivery was clipped, professional, neither defensive nor deferential, just fact. Brackett stepped closer, eyes sweeping the aircraft, then the open toolbox at her side. His hand paused over a black leather-bound book nestled among socket extensions. He plucked it free, flipping the cover with one thumb. "A diary?" The question was pitched loud enough for nearby pilots to catch. "My civilian flight logbook, sir," Marina replied, still at attention. He leafed through the pages with no sign of recognition for what they represented. The early morning flights, the doubled shifts to pay for lessons, the inked hours that traced her climb toward certification. He snapped it shut. "Mechanics have no business pretending to be pilots. This stays with me." He tucked it under his arm, a captured flag. "Now, get back to your work." He pivoted and walked off, leaving behind the smell of starch and authority. The onlookers dispersed without a word. Marina returned to her creeper, sliding back under the Hornet's belly, eyes on the actuator, but her mind catalogued the new absence in her toolbox like a missing tooth she couldn't stop touching. The rest of the shift blurred. She finished the post-flush check, signed off the inspection sheet, and stowed her tools with mechanical precision. Not once did she let her pace falter, but every completed task came with the hollow echo of that logbook-shaped gap. When the hangar finally emptied and the sun dipped low enough to ease the heat radiating from the concrete, she locked her kit, clocked out, and walked the long path to her quarters. The barracks smelled faintly of detergent and old coffee. Her room, standard-issue bed, footlocker, desk, felt smaller than usual. She opened the footlocker. The space where she used to keep the logbook was bare. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, forearms resting on her knees, fingertips still carrying the tacky ghost of hydraulic fluid. Out on the flight line, the Hornets would be cooling under the floodlights, metal contracting in the desert night. Inside, the silence pressed in, heavier than the heat ever was. She didn't look at her phone. Not yet. Not while her mother might be calling, asking about flight hours she could no longer log. Not while the only answer she had would be a lie. Morning réveil broke across Redstone Airbase with the metallic clang of the PA system, the sound bouncing off hangar walls and corrugated roofs. The desert light was still pale, the heat not yet oppressive, but the air already carried the faint tang of jet fuel and scorched metal. Staff Sergeant Marina Solis stepped out of the barracks in her grease-stained coveralls, boots laced tight, her tool belt slung over one shoulder. The metal buckles clicked softly against each other with each step. For years that sound had been the beginning of her day, the sound of readiness, but this morning the weight on her hip felt wrong. At the hangar entrance, a clipboard waited on the duty desk. She scanned the assignments sheet like she always did, looking for Hornet 302 or any of the aircraft she had poured herself into over the last 2 years. Instead, her eyes landed on a different line, written in block capitals: Solis, wheel well maintenance, non-critical, cleaning, C-130, Hangar 4. Her thumb tightened on the edge of the clipboard until the paper crinkled. She read it again, slower. Wheel well maintenance, non-critical cleaning, C-130 seconds. Cargo haulers. Work so far below her qualifications it wasn't even part of her old team's rotation. It was given to green recruits on their first week. Change of scenery, came a voice from behind her. She turned. Tech Sergeant Mullins leaned in the doorway, coffee in hand, expression unreadable. His gaze flicked to the sheet, then back to her. Orders came down from Brackett yesterday. Guess you're in Hangar 4 for a while. She kept her voice level. Reason? Didn't say. Didn't have to. He took a sip, eyes dropping. Better get moving. C-130's due out for a supply run. She nodded once, clipped and silent, and walked away. Hangar 4 was colder than the fighter bays, a cavernous space that smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid, but mostly of floor polish. The C-130 squatted in the center like a bloated whale, flanked by stepladders and scaffolding. The crews here moved slower. There was no rush in their steps, no adrenaline of prepping a machine for supersonic combat maneuvers. A young airman handed her a bucket of degreaser and a stack of rags without meeting her eyes. "Wheel wells, Sergeant. Both sides." She slid under the first wing, ducking into the shadowed cavity of the wheel assembly. It was a cramped space of pipes, struts and rubber, caked in the baked-on residue of 100 landings. She set to work with mechanical precision. Spray, wipe, inspect, repeat. The smell of solvent bit at her nostrils. The work was mindless, but not harmless. The message was clear. She was off the Hornets. Off anything critical. She'd been pulled from the tightrope act of keeping supersonic fighters airworthy and dumped into the equivalent of mopping the floor in a machine shop. Her mind flicked back, unbidden, to the sound of Brackett's voice the day before. Mechanics have no business pretending to be pilots. She forced the memory down, focusing instead on the rhythm of her hands. If she let her thoughts wander too far, the anger would bleed into her movements, and even a C-130 deserved better than that. At midday, she stripped her gloves and headed for the mess hall. Inside, the noise of cutlery and conversation hit like a wall. She scanned the room. Her old crew was gathered at their usual table near the windows. Mullins, Vargas, Dempsey. None of them looked up as she passed. She carried her tray to a small table by the wall. Halfway through her meal, she caught fragments of conversation from 2 tables over. Guess she's Brackett's example now. Don't get ideas above your pay grade, right? The laughter that followed was thin, like old paint cracking. She didn't turn. She didn't give them the satisfaction. The next days fell into a slow, grinding rhythm. Morning in Hangar 4, wheel wells, landing gear struts, cargo bay fittings. In the afternoons, she was sent to assist on transport aircraft preps, tasks so rudimentary they were practically ceremonial. Tightening inspection panel screws that no one cared about, swapping out light bulbs in crew compartments. The real sting wasn't the work, it was the isolation. On the Hornet line, her world had been a constant current of clipped technical exchanges, shouted talk specs, and the whine of powered tools. Here, conversation dried up whenever she stepped close. Airmen avoided eye contact. When she approached a toolbox, someone else would suddenly need it across the hangar. By the end of the first week, she realized she hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone outside of formal work orders. The sabotage began on Monday. She reached for her torque wrench mid-task and found the slot empty. Checked the next drawer. Empty. An hour later, she spotted it sticking out from behind a stack of unused tires. No one claimed responsibility. Wednesday, she handed in a maintenance report, meticulously filled, signed and logged, to the supply office. By Friday, the same supervisor who'd signed it handed it back, saying it had never arrived. On Thursday, she unscrewed the cap from her water bottle during a break, and a handful of fine grit poured out with the first sip. They were small acts, petty acts, but they carried the same signature: "You don't belong here." One evening, she lingered in the hangar after the others had gone, standing at the edge of the C-130's shadow. The big transport's bulk blocked most of the overhead lights, casting her in a pool of half-dark. She stared at the aircraft's wheel assembly, seeing not the simple utilitarian structure, but the echo of a Hornet's landing gear. Sleek, precise, dangerous. Her hands itched for the complex interplay of hydraulics and avionics, for the feeling of responsibility when a machine's performance could mean life or death. Here, the stakes were as low as the work itself. She packed her tools in silence, the clang of each piece hitting the metal tray echoing off the hangar walls. By the end of the second week, her reputation had shifted in ways she could feel but not fully map. She wasn't the girl on the Hornet line anymore. She was a cautionary tale. New airmen glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, like she was a monument to some unspoken base policy. She ate alone, worked alone, walked back to her quarters along the perimeter fence, the desert stretching away in shades of rust and shadow. Some nights, the distant glow of the flight line lights was the only proof that the Hornets were still there, alive and flying without her. Her logbook, still locked away in Brackett's office, haunted her like an amputated limb. She didn't let herself dwell on it during the day, but at night, lying on her bunk, she would feel the phantom weight of it in her hands, the texture of the leather cover, the faint smell of ink and paper. It wasn't just a record of flight hours, it was the sum total of her claim to the sky, and right now it was in the hands of the one man determined to keep her grounded. The morning light in Arizona had a hard edge to it, the kind that cut straight through the thin air and bounced off every riveted surface on the tarmac. From her post beside Hangar 4, Marina could see the main flight line in the distance, specks of motion framed by the shimmer of rising heat. She was on her knees, elbow deep in the landing gear bay of a C-130, wiping the last traces of degreaser from the metal skin. A sharp sound caught her attention, the metallic snap of a pre-flight checklist being flipped too fast. Her eyes shifted toward the Hornet line. A young pilot in a crisp, barely wrinkled flight suit was moving along the flank of an F-18 Hornet 312, his helmet tucked under one arm, the checklist clamped between two fingers. From this distance she could read his body language as easily as if he were standing beside her. He was rushing, skipping half steps in the inspection sequence, touching points on the airframe like he was checking boxes in his head rather than with his hands. Her gaze narrowed when he reached the wing root. The flap actuator, critical for safe takeoff and landing, sat partially exposed after maintenance the day before. She watched him test it with one hand, the motion too abrupt, the pressure too heavy. The faint metallic clack carried across the tarmac to her, sharper than the ambient hum of the bass. She knew that sound. It was the noise a fatigued part made when stressed past its tolerance, a sound that didn't belong in a healthy actuator. It could mean a hairline crack, maybe worse. Left unchecked, it would stay invisible until the flaps were needed most. Her cleaning rag dropped to the ground without a thought. She was already striding toward the Hornet line, her boots finding the fastest path between painted taxi lanes. The desert heat pressed against her, but she barely felt it. The young pilot was just finishing his walk-around when she reached him. "Captain," she said, voice pitched low but firm, "hold up. I need to take another look at that actuator. I think there's a fault from your check just now." He looked down at her, literally, given the height difference, and frowned. "It's fine, Sergeant. I followed procedure. I heard the actuator pop under load," she countered. "That's not normal." His jaw tightened, eyes flicking toward a pair of junior crew members who'd been watching from a few meters away. "With respect, Sergeant, you're not cleared to re-inspect my bird. I've got a launch window." She took a half step closer, holding his gaze. "If that part fails mid-flight, you won't get to worry about your launch window." The tension between them was still tightening when another voice sliced into the space like a blade. "What's going on here?" Colonel Brackett's shadow fell across both of them. His tone was already loaded, the question more accusation than inquiry. "Nothing, sir," the pilot said quickly, just about to taxi. Marina didn't look away. "Sir, I believe there's a defect in the flap actuator. I need clearance to—" Brackett's hand came up, palm out, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You have an assignment, Staff Sergeant. I believe it involves wheel wells, not interfering with flight crew." "Sir, if that actuator fails—" I said enough. His voice carried just loud enough for nearby personnel to hear. "Return to your post. Now." The young pilot moved almost gratefully toward the cockpit ladder. The two junior crew members scattered back to their tasks. Brackett didn't move until Marina stepped away. Her jaw clenched so hard it ached. Back in Hangar 4, she tried to throw herself into the C-130's landing gear inspection, but every movement of her hands was haunted by the metallic clack she'd heard. She could picture the part in cross-section, see the weak point in her mind. The knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. From the hangar's side door, she watched Hornet 312 taxi out. Sunlight flashed along its canopy as it rolled into position. Seconds later, the roar of its afterburners tore across the base, shaking dust from the rafters above her head. Her hand tightened on the edge of the wheel well until her knuckles went white. There was nothing she could do now, nothing the chain of command would let her do. She'd raised the flag. Brackett had pulled it down. The Hornet climbed into the sky, the heat shimmer swallowing it whole. That afternoon, the base felt subtly different. The routine hum of the C-130 hangar was undisturbed. But every time she stepped outside for tools or parts, her eyes searched the sky. Most of the Hornets cycled in and out without issue, but she kept track of 312 feet's absence. By mid-shift, she'd checked the wall clock more than once. The bird should have been back. The only update came indirectly, a ripple of chatter from a couple of fuel crew members passing by. "Falcon something's still up," one said. "Comms are spotty." She caught their words without reacting outwardly, but her stomach tightened. Comms trouble on a fighter already carrying a suspect actuator was a bad mix. The part would hold at cruise, but landing was another story. She bent back over the wheel well, rag moving automatically over hydraulic lines, but her ears stayed tuned for any change in the tone of activity outside, any sign that 312 was inbound. When the Hornet finally reappeared hours later, it came in low over the runway, afterburners off, angle of attack slightly higher than she liked. She watched from the edge of Hangar 4 as its wheels kissed the tarmac harder than they should have, the airframe shuddering in visible protest. It rolled out and taxied past the hangar at reduced speed. She scanned the flaps. Both were down, but the port side hung just a fraction lower than the starboard. To anyone else it was nothing. To her it was confirmation. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She knew the game Brackett was playing. If the part failed on the ground, it would be blamed on routine wear. If it failed in the air, it would be written up as an unavoidable mechanical fault. Either way, her warning would never make it into the record. And somewhere in the middle of that calculus was a pilot who didn't know how close he'd just come to losing his aircraft. The next morning, her assignment sheet was the same as before. Wheel wells, non-critical cleaning. She read it without expression, clipped the clipboard back onto the desk and walked toward Hangar 4. If Brackett's intent was to keep her away from fighters, he was succeeding. But that didn't mean she'd stop watching. From her corner of the base, she kept her eyes on the Hornet line. She learned the patterns, who prepped which birds, which pilots skipped which checks, which airframes had quirks the manuals didn't cover. The flap actuator on 312 wasn't the only part on the flight line that made her uneasy, but it was the one that had been placed directly in her hands to catch and then pulled away. She didn't know how long it would take or what shape it would come in, but she understood one thing with absolute clarity. The next time the chain of command failed to act, she would not be standing on the sidelines. The desert wind carried the smell of burnt jet fuel all the way to the far edge of Redstone Airbase, where Hangar 4 sat like an afterthought. Marina had spent the morning inside the dim, echoing space, polishing the wheel rims of a transport plane so spotless they could have passed for display pieces. The work was done to spec, every bolt tightened, every line inspected, yet none of it stirred her pulse the way a fighter's systems did. The C-130 loomed over her like a lumbering beast bred for utility, not for grace. When she clocked out for lunch, the walk to the mess hall felt longer than usual. The heat on the pavement shimmered in waves, mirages rising and vanishing at the edges of her vision. She kept her head down, boots striking a steady rhythm, until a familiar sound pulled her gaze up, the scream of twin engines winding down on final approach. A Hornet sliced through the blue, banking with predatory elegance before dropping toward the runway. Even from here she recognized the tail number, 312. The same aircraft she'd warned about. The landing looked clean enough from a distance, but her gut stayed tight. She didn't wait around to see it taxi in. Watching it roll to a stop without knowing if the actuator had degraded further was a torment she didn't need right now. Inside the mess hall, the usual noise greeted her. Forks against metal trays, bursts of conversation, the occasional shout of someone greeting a friend across the room. She took her food and chose a seat by the far wall, facing the windows. Her old crew was clustered together in their usual spot, laughter rising and falling like a private signal she wasn't part of anymore. She didn't try to join. The invisible boundary had been drawn weeks ago. Halfway through her meal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, saw her mother's name on the screen and froze. For a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail, but that would only invite more calls, more questions. She swiped to answer. "Mija," her mother's voice came warm and bright, cutting through the background noise. "How's the flying going? You getting close to your license?" Marina closed her eyes briefly. "Yeah, Mom, making progress." "That's wonderful. Your Tio asked about you the other day. He wants to come see you fly when you get your wings." She smiled faintly, though it felt brittle. "I'll let you know when it's time." They spoke for another minute, her mother sharing neighborhood gossip, small talk about the weather back home. When the call ended, Marina sat with the phone in her hand, the lie lodged like a pebble in her throat. The logbook was still locked away in Brackett's office. The flights she was making progress on didn't exist. She put the phone away, finished her meal without tasting it, and returned to Hangar 4. The rest of the shift passed in the same muted rhythm. Tasks completed, reports filed, eyes always drifting toward the open hangar doors where glimpses of the Hornet line teased her peripheral vision. She'd learned to read the base by sound. The rising whine of engines told her who was taking off. The deep, throaty idle marked who'd just landed. Even without seeing them, she could picture the birds in motion, and the ache of separation never lessened. That night, lying on her bunk, she stared at the ceiling fan spinning in lazy circles. Her mind wasn't on the C-130 or the petty sabotage that sometimes made her work harder than it needed to be. It was on the open sky, and how little access she had to it now. 2 days later, she made a decision. If she couldn't touch the Hornets on base, she'd find her way into the air another way. On her next day off, she called the small civilian airstrip outside town. The man who picked up, Gus, had known her for years. He'd seen her work through flight lessons on scraps of free time, renting Cessnas whenever her schedule and budget allowed. "Hey, Marina," he greeted, voice as easy as a summer morning. "What can I do for you?" "I want to book the 172 for a couple hours next Thursday," she said, trying to keep the edge of anticipation out of her voice. A pause, longer than it should have been. "I'm sorry, kiddo. She's down for maintenance that week. Fuel system issue. Whole week. That's the plan. We've got a mechanic coming in to look at it." She frowned. Gus was a straight talker, but the hesitation in his voice felt off. "All right, thanks." They hung up, and she sat on the edge of her bed staring at the phone. The next morning she tried another airstrip 50 miles out. The voice on the other end told her all their planes were booked for a private event. She tried a third, 70 miles away. No new students. Fourth call, "We're not taking any outside rentals right now." By the end of the day, she'd called every civilian field within a 100-mile radius. The answer was always some variation of no. Different words, same rhythm, too uniform to be coincidence. The pattern was clear. Someone had closed the doors. She didn't need to guess who had the reach and the motive. That night, she walked the perimeter path around the base, the chain-link fence throwing long shadows under the floodlights. Beyond it, the desert stretched out in silent dunes. The Hornets were a distant gleam under the hangar lights, their outlines sharp against the dark. She stopped, leaning a hand against the fence, eyes tracing the familiar curves of their silhouettes. She thought of her grandfather's words, passed down in his quiet way, "Your hands know the aircraft before your mind does." He'd meant it as a lesson in trust, in listening to the machine. But now it felt like something else, an indictment of how far she'd been pushed from where she belonged. When she finally returned to her quarters, she found sleep elusive. The night hummed with the muffled roar of late sorties, the occasional thump of gear settling into place after landing. She lay still, listening, as if by sound alone she could bridge the gap between her bunk and the cockpit. The following week she went through the motions of her assigned duties, but her mind worked elsewhere. She began watching more closely. Who left which hangar when? Which aircraft were being prepped for which missions? She didn't yet know what she was looking for, only that she needed to be ready if the moment came. One afternoon, as she stepped out to fetch a part from storage, the sky cracked open with the roar of afterburners at full throttle. A Hornet streaked past overhead, low enough that the vibrations shook the air in her lungs. Instinctively she glanced up, and something about the pitch of the engines, the faint stagger in their harmony, told her this wasn't a routine takeoff. She squinted, following the bird's climb. Her chest tightened when she caught the tail number. 312! Her pace slowed as the jet climbed higher, banking into a turn that was a shade too sharp, too quick for the smooth arc of a healthy airframe. The faint warning in her gut flared hot. She had tried to keep her distance, tried to abide by the invisible leash bracket had looped around her, but the sight of that bird in the sky twisted something inside her. If the opportunity came, if the systems failed in a way only she could fix, she knew exactly what she would do, and it wouldn't involve asking for permission. The afternoon sun over Redstone Airbase burned hot enough to make the tarmac shimmer like liquid. The flight schedule was in full swing, Hornets taking turns screaming into the sky, their departure times staggered to keep the air lanes clear. From the open doors of Hangar 4, Marina watched the procession without appearing to watch at all. Her hands were busy, her posture bent to a C-130's undercarriage, but her attention was elsewhere. On the line, Hornet 312 had been refueled and armed for a high-speed training run. Its pilot, Captain Rylan Hayes, was known on base for a calm that held steady even when the air was turbulent and tempers frayed. He moved through his pre-flight checklist without wasted motion, helmet cradled under one arm until the final moment. Marina recognized the way he carried himself, efficient, precise, but she also knew that precision didn't mean invincibility. Somewhere in the guts of that machine, the flap actuator she'd worried about still sat, its integrity questionable, the invisible fracture biding its time. She saw him climb the ladder, slide into the cockpit, and pull the canopy down with a solid seal. A crew chief gave the signal, and the Hornet rolled out onto the taxiway, sun glare flashing along its canopy. The engine spooled up to a piercing roar. With a violent kick of afterburners, 312 launched down the runway, nose lifting, wings cutting clean into the sky. From Hangar 4, Marina's eyes tracked it until it was a glint against the bright horizon. She forced herself back to her work, but her body remained keyed to the rhythms of the base, the Doppler shift in engine tone. As aircraft banked, the distant crackle of tower comms over the PA, the staccato bursts of maintenance chatter from the open hangar doors. 20 minutes later, that background rhythm changed. It began as a gap, an absence where a tower update should have been. Then the clipped voice of a controller came over the PA, words half lost to static. "Falcon-12, repeat, confirm status." Marina froze under the C-130 wrench suspended in mid-turn. The call sign wasn't common, it meant 312. The next transmission was worse, garbled, a snake hiss of interference. Only fragments emerged. Flap control, negative response, primary comms. She rolled out from under the aircraft and crossed to the hangar door. Outside, the heat slapped her in the face, but her eyes were already searching the sky. Far out over the desert, a speck moved in a jerky, uneven line. She knew the difference between a smooth flight path and one held together by constant correction. What she was seeing was the latter. Above 20,000 feet, Hayes was wrestling with a machine that no longer obeyed. Inside his cockpit, the control surfaces didn't match his inputs. The flap indicator was frozen, the digital alert pulsing red. He ran through the emergency checklist by muscle memory, cycle the flap system, test the hydraulic pressure, reset the control module. Each attempt ended the same, nothing. The real problem wasn't only the flaps, it was the silence. His primary comms had gone dead minutes ago, replaced by static sharp enough to sting his ears. The backup channel worked in bursts, but each word he sent came back shredded by interference. Back on the ground, the control tower knew enough to understand the danger, but not enough to solve it. From her vantage point, Marina could see the activity up there. Figures moving quickly behind the glass, the sweep of binoculars, the frantic pointing toward 312 feet's position. Her stomach knotted. She had seen this coming, down to the likely sequence of failure. It wasn't foresight, it was the inevitable outcome of a compromised part ignored long enough to choose its own moment to break. A crash truck rolled past the hangar, at a steady but urgent pace, lights flashing without sirens. Ground crews in reflective vests jogged toward standby positions along the runway. The atmosphere thickened, an unspoken admission that something serious was unfolding. She didn't move at first. There was nothing in her orders that would justify leaving her post, nothing in Brackett's narrow definition of her duties that allowed her to act. But her eyes stayed locked on that faltering speck in the sky. She watched it attempt to turn, saw the nose dip too far before jerking back into line. Every correction bled speed, every degree lost would make the landing harder to recover. Hayes tried the comms again. Redstone Tower, Falcon-12, backup channel, advise, fuel low. The words fractured into white noise before the sentence could finish. The controllers exchanged quick, clipped instructions, trying to relay vectors with hand signals to other aircraft in the area. It was too slow, too imprecise. In Hangar 4, Marina's hand tightened around the handle of her toolkit. She wasn't thinking about the reprimand that would follow or the weeks of isolation she'd endured. She was thinking about the actuator, about the way that clack had sounded under strain, and about how little time was left for anyone else to fix the problem. The decision wasn't a choice, it was an instinct. She slung the kit over her shoulder and stepped out into the open, her pace breaking into a run as soon as she cleared the hangar's shadow. The sun hammered her back, heat radiating from the concrete with every stride, but the control tower was already in her sights. Up above, Falcon-12 banked again, fighting the air like an injured bird. The next 10 minutes would decide if it made the runway at all. Marina didn't plan to spend those 10 minutes watching. The control tower loomed ahead, a vertical slab of concrete and glass against the flat sprawl of the airfield. Heat radiated off every surface, blurring the edges of her vision, but Marina kept running. Her boots hammered the tarmac in a steady cadence, her toolkit slamming rhythmically against her back. She knew the layout of the tower better than some of the airmen assigned to it. In her years on the Hornet line, she'd been called up more than once to troubleshoot auxiliary panels and back-end systems. She knew which doors were locked, which stairs skipped the landing sensors, and, most importantly, where the lifelines of the base's communication network converged. She didn't slow until she reached the rear service door. To anyone else, it was just another featureless metal panel, unmarked except for a fading warning decal. She pulled the thin strip of master keys from her coverall pocket, fingers finding the worn-to-shine brass that matched this lock. The key turned with a muted click, and the heavy door swung inward to reveal the narrow maintenance corridor. Inside, the air was cooler but stank faintly of dust and electrical ozone. Emergency lights cast the concrete walls in a dull red glow. There was no reason for full illumination down here. The sound of her footsteps was absorbed into the thick industrial carpeting as she cut left, then right, moving deeper into the tower's underbelly. At the far end of the corridor, a metal hatch waited. She knelt, setting her toolkit on the floor, and twisted the locking wheel. The hinges groaned as she pulled it open, revealing a vertical shaft lined with ladder rungs. Above, faint light spilled down from the grating that separated this crawl space from the main comms floor. She climbed quickly, toolkit slung crosswise to keep it tight against her body. Halfway up, a murmur of voices filtered through the shaft, sharp, urgent, the clipped syllables of men trying to coordinate something that wasn't working. She recognized Brackett's voice immediately, loud enough to carry authority, brittle enough to betray strain. The comms room itself lay one floor below the glass-walled tower cabin. It was a cramped rectangular space dominated by rack after rack of electronics, transceivers, routing modules, signal boosters, and miles of neatly bundled cabling. The air hummed with the combined vibration of all that hardware. One glance told her where the problem was. In the corner, the backup communications array, intended to handle exactly this kind of failure, was drawing unstable power. The status lights on its front panel flickered in irregular patterns, like a dying heartbeat. She stepped forward, setting her toolkit down with deliberate care. The floor's industrial carpet muffled the sound, but the faint metallic clink of her tools drew the attention of a junior comms tech hunched over a diagnostics console. "You can't be in here," he started, then stopped when he saw her pull the array's main access panel open. "Which side's feeding the backup antenna?" she asked without looking up. He hesitated. "Upper right module." "But it's—" She was already inside, hands moving in precise, economical motions. The heat from the circuitry was immediate, radiating up her forearms as she stripped away the bundled cabling from its mounts. A single black lead was misseated, its copper shielding scorched where it had arced against the frame. Whoever had wired it last had left the connection vulnerable, enough that vibration or temperature swings could throw the whole channel into chaos. She fished a length of fresh shielded cable from her kit. "Kill power to the backup module," she told the tech. "That'll drop the last comm link to Falcon-12. "It's already useless," she said flatly. "Give me 30 seconds. He cut the feed and the module's hum faded to silence. She unseated the damaged lead, snipped it clean, then ran the new cable into place with the practiced speed of someone who'd lived inside machinery for most of her adult life. Each connection point was tightened until her fingertips read the torque as right. When she signaled, the tech restored power. The module spun up with a low whine, status lights cycling through amber to steady green. The hiss of dead air in the overhead speakers shifted, still rough with static, but now carrying a human voice beneath it. "Tower, this is Falcon-12. Fuel critical. Approach unstable." It was faint, breaking up every few syllables, but it was there. She closed her kit, scooped it up, and headed for the narrow stairwell at the far end of the room. She'd done her part to restore the channel. Now she needed to be on the other end of it. The stairwell was a tight spiral, metal grating underfoot ringing with each step. The higher she climbed, the clearer the voices became, clipped exchanges between controllers, the crackle of incoming calls, the sharp edge of Brackett's tone as he issued instructions. She emerged into the glass-walled tower cabin like a sudden gust. Heads turned. Every operator and controller looked up from their stations, their gazes tracking the small figure in oil-streaked coveralls moving straight toward the primary console. Brackett was at the central station, one hand braced on the console's edge, eyes locked on the radar display that tracked Falcon-12's erratic path toward the base. His head snapped up at the sound of her boots on the metal decking. "Staff Sergeant Solis," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You're out of line." She didn't break stride. "I reconnected your backup channel. You've got partial comms. You were not authorized to. Do you want him down alive or not?" Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. The room went still. Even the background chatter from the secondary stations faded. Brackett's mouth tightened, but he didn't move to stop her as she reached for the spare headset hanging beside the console. She slipped it on, adjusted the mic, and keyed into the newly stable backup feed. "Falcon-12, this is Redstone Tower. I have you on partial. Do you copy?" A pause. Then Hayes's voice came through, ragged but intact. "Tower, read you. Barely. Controls compromised. Fuel low." "I'm Staff Sergeant Solis," she said. "I've worked on your bird. You've got a flap actuator failure. Primary hydraulics are dead. I'm going to walk you through the manual override." From the corner of her vision, she saw Brackett stiffen. "You are not authorized to instruct." She tuned him out. "Falcon-12, look just aft of your throttle quadrant. Red lever marked auxiliary flap release. Found it. Two-stage release. Push forward and hold 3 seconds. You'll feel a pressure dump, then the manual cables will engage. You'll need to trim with ailerons and rudder. Flaps won't respond normally." Static hissed, then copy. "Engaging now." Brackett took a step closer, lowering his voice. "If this goes wrong—" "It already is," she replied without turning. On the radar, Falcon-12's track wavered, then steadied slightly. Hayes's breathing was audible over the channel, the rough cadence of someone wrestling both machine and physics. "Override engaged," he said. "Good. Now bring your speed down in increments. Don't dump throttle all at once. Pitch will fight you on descent. Compensate early and be ready. Gusts are high today." As if summoned, a new alert flashed on the console, wind shear warning along the primary approach. "Falcon-12, abort primary. We're taking you to secondary runway. You'll catch the arrestor cable. It'll be rough, but it'll hold." Hayes didn't argue. "Copy." Turning for secondary, Marina guided him through the long banking approach, her voice even, precise. Every instruction was grounded in years of tactile knowledge, how the controls should feel, the subtle shift in engine note when drag increased, the rhythm of adjusting pitch and yaw together. Below, the ground crews repositioned. The arrestor cable stretched taut across the far end of the secondary runway. Fire suppression rigs stood ready, their crews watching the sky. The Hornet came in fast, nose high, engines straining against the drag of partial control. At the last 100 meters, Hayes dropped the tailhook. It snagged the cable with a whip-crack sound, the jet shuddering violently as its forward momentum bled out in seconds. When it stopped, the silence in the tower was electric. Then Hayes's voice came through, strained but steady. "Tower, Falcon-12, down safe." Marina exhaled slowly, lowering the headset to the console. Around her, the controllers sat frozen for a heartbeat longer before the room erupted in applause. She didn't join it. Her eyes stayed on the speck of grey and gold out on the tarmac, motionless but intact. Brackett said nothing. She didn't look at him as she turned and walked for the stairwell, toolkit in hand. The air inside the tower stairwell felt heavier on the way down, like every step was drawing her back into gravity after being weightless. Marina kept her hand light on the rail, toolkit swinging at her side, the muted roar of ground operations seeping up from the open door below. She stepped out into the dry furnace of the flight line, blinking against the glare. The base was in motion again. Emergency vehicles rolling back to their bays, fire crews breaking down their positions, maintenance teams jogging toward the resting Hornet on the secondary runway. Even from here, she could see the telltale slack in the arrestor cable where it had done its job and saved a pilot's life. Marina's boots carried her toward Hangar 4 out of habit, but her mind replayed every detail of the last 10 minutes, the stiffness in Hayes' voice, the subtle steadiness in his control once the manual override took, the way the radar sweep smoothed on the tower's display. She'd been on the periphery for weeks, walled off from the work that mattered, but in that room, with a headset pressed to her ear and a man's life hanging on the channel, no one questioned whether she belonged. She reached the hangar just as a shadow fell across the doorway. Captain Rylan Hayes had beaten her there. Helmet still in hand, flight suit damp with sweat, he looked nothing like the calm, unshakable image she'd seen at a distance before. His hair was plastered to his forehead, a dark line of salt tracing the side of his face where sweat had cut through the desert grit. But his eyes, sharp, focused and very much alive, locked on her the moment she appeared. "You're Solis," he said, not a question. She nodded once. "You kept me in the air," he added, voice low, pitched for her alone, "and you got me on the ground in one piece. I've been in situations where the person on the other end of the comms made the difference. Today, that was you." Marina set her toolkit down by the wall. "I did my job," she said. Hayes' mouth quirked, not quite a smile. "Your job? From what I hear, you weren't supposed to be anywhere near that tower." She didn't answer. Silence was safer. He studied her for another moment, then extended a gloved hand. She took it briefly, the leather still warm from the cockpit. Without another word, he turned and headed toward the debrief building, leaving her alone with the cooling echo of afterburners in the distance. The official debrief took place in the operations room, a square, windowless space with 2 bright lights and the scent of recycled air. The pilots and senior officers filed in, the murmur of subdued conversation filling the corners. Brackett was already at the head of the table, posture as rigid as the lines on his uniform. When Hayes entered, the room subtly shifted. Eyes followed him as he crossed to the front, every head turning just enough to track his path. He didn't take the empty seat beside Brackett. Instead, he stopped halfway down the table, facing the assembled personnel. "Yesterday," he began, his voice carrying clearly, "Falcon-12 went up for a training run. Midway through, I lost primary flap control. A few minutes later, primary comms went down. Backup channel was so saturated with interference it was useless. There was no rustle of papers, no shuffling of feet, just the quiet, watchful stillness of people who knew exactly how close that combination of failures had come to ending in disaster. I followed protocol. Nothing worked," Hayes continued. "I was running out of fuel and out of options. Then someone came on the channel, not a controller, not a pilot, a mechanic, Staff Sergeant Marina Solis. A ripple went through the room, quick and sharp. But Hayes didn't pause. She knew my aircraft systems well enough to guide me through a manual override I'd never used. When the wind shear hit, she recalculated my approach on the fly and diverted me to the secondary runway for a cable catch. I did what she told me, and I'm standing here because of it." He let that settle before speaking again. "I've put in a formal recommendation for the Air Force Commendation Medal for Sergeant Solis and for her immediate entry into officer training. This force needs people like her in the cockpit as much as on the hangar floor." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Then, almost imperceptibly, heads began to turn toward the far end of the room, toward where Marina stood, back straight, hands loosely clasped behind her. Brackett's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. That evening, she was in her quarters when a knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Brackett himself standing there, the same ramrod posture, but something different in his eyes. In his hands was a small black leather-bound book, her logbook. "Staff Sergeant," he said, voice low but formal, "I was wrong. My judgment was flawed, and my actions were a disservice to this unit and to you." He extended the book. She took it without a word, feeling the familiar weight settle into her palms. "This," he went on, producing an envelope from under his arm, "is a formal letter of apology, signed by me. It will be placed in your permanent file. I've also endorsed your commendation and officer training recommendation." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Brackett gave a single short nod and stepped back. "You'll report to the training office at 0800. She closed the door slowly, setting the envelope on the desk and holding the logbook a moment longer before opening it. The pages were exactly as she remembered. Every flight, every signature, every carefully inked hour accounted for. Nothing erased, nothing altered. She sat on the edge of the bed, the sound of distant engines drifting in through the narrow window, and for the first time in weeks, the silence in the room felt like space opening instead of walls closing in. Tomorrow would be different, and it would be hers. The training field at Redstone looked nothing like the clean symmetry of the flight line. Here, everything was functional to the point of brutality: scorched strips of asphalt for short takeoff and landing practice, a skeletal control tower with paint worn pale by sun and wind, and a scattering of prefabricated classrooms that rattled in a stiff breeze. There were no ceremonial salutes here, no polished briefings, only the rhythm of instruction, failure, correction, and repetition until even the muscles stopped arguing. Marina stood at the edge of the tarmac in a fresh flight suit, the fabric still stiff from issue, her logbook clipped to a slim board at her side. It was strange to feel the weight of the suit again, the seal of the cuffs and collar shutting her into the role she'd been trained for years ago. Around her, candidates moved in tight groups, trading clipped sentences, eyes tracking the instructors who prowled the space like wolves, keeping count of the herd. Captain Hayes was here too, not as her advocate but as one of the evaluation pilots. He stood near the lineup of trainers, arms folded, visor down, the set of his shoulders neither friendly nor hostile. He'd made it clear when they crossed paths before the session, in this arena there would be no favors. The first drill was deceptively simple. Run through a standard takeoff and pattern flight in the T-38, return for a precision landing. The instructors watched everything: posture in the cockpit, throttle discipline, radio clarity. When Marina climbed into her assigned aircraft, the switch from ground weight to cockpit silence hit hard. Her fingers moved without hesitation, checking each circuit, each light, each trim setting. The canopy locked, and the world reduced to the framed rectangle of sky ahead. Her takeoff was clean, pattern steady. But halfway through the final turn to base, the instructor in her headset threw a deviation. "Engine 1 failure. Respond." She didn't curse, didn't even exhale sharply. Throttle back, rudder compensate, feed in trim. The yaw eased, the frame steadied, altitude loss minimal. She could almost feel the instructor's eyes narrowing on the ground. Maintain heading. Fuel dump initiated. Land in 800 feet. The strip ahead was shorter than regulation, marked by faded paint and flanked by dirt shoulders. She brought the nose down, flaps set, and let the sink rate build just enough to bite the landing gear into asphalt. The touchdown was firm but centered, braking hard enough to pull the straps against her shoulders. She rolled to a stop with 100 feet to spare. When she climbed out, there was no applause, only the next candidate moving to the ladder. That was the nature of this place. Success was just permission to keep going. The classroom phase hit differently. Here they stripped back the muscle memory and went for the mind, running through scenarios that started as textbook and ended in chaos. One exercise opened with a routine patrol route. By the 10th minute, they had lost navigational instruments, primary comms, and 2 points of reference on the horizon to simulated weather. Most candidates tried to fly out of it. Marina cut speed, stabilized, and recalculated bearings from last known position, using wind drift estimates and fuel consumption to plot an intercept to friendly airspace. When she laid out her reasoning, the room was quiet. One of the instructors tapped the board once and said, "That's how you bring your crew home." Not everyone welcomed her presence. In the narrow corridor outside the briefing hall, she caught the tail end of a conversation not meant for her ears. Got bumped from the roster so she could waltz in here. Brackett's penance project. Hayes must think she walks on water. She didn't stop walking, but later, in the locker room, she found her helmet strap cut halfway through, enough that it would snap under tension. She replaced it without comment, logged the incident with the quartermaster, and made sure to test every piece of gear twice before strapping in from then on. By the 3rd week, the evaluations shifted to team drills. 4 aircraft formations, live-fire targeting runs, and split-second handovers between pilots when simulated threats took out the lead. Marina flew as 2 for the first run. Lead took a hit on the second pass, and she rolled into position without waiting for the call, lining up the target and firing within the window. The simulated ground unit went cold on the instructor's screen. When they landed, Hayes walked past her without a word, but there was the smallest shift in his posture, less guarded, more considering. The final segment of the day was unexpected. They gathered on the observation deck overlooking the auxiliary strip, where a single unfamiliar airframe sat under the sun. Sleek lines, camo pattern too new to be standard issue. This, the lead instructor said, is a modified test platform for systems integration trials. You will each take a 15-minute flight to evaluate control responsiveness and provide feedback. By the time it was her turn, the desert light was sliding toward amber. She climbed in, noting the unfamiliar layout, the subtle resistance in the side stick, the way the HUD prioritized data differently. She rolled out, accelerated, and lifted clean into the air. The controls were tight, almost too precise, demanding a steady hand to keep from overcorrecting. Halfway through the run, the systems flagged an intermittent signal loss in one of the actuator channels. Nothing critical, but enough to demand attention. She didn't call it in. Instead, she ran a quick diagnostic, isolated the fluctuation, and adjusted inputs manually to smooth the response. By the time she landed, the glitch had stabilized. An engineer in plain clothes met her at the ladder, asking pointed questions about what she'd felt, what she'd adjusted, how she'd compensated. She answered plainly, stripped of ego, all mechanics and numbers. When she walked back across the strip, she could feel eyes on her from the observation deck. She didn't look up. That night, in her quarters, she opened the logbook again. The day's entries were short, almost clinical, but the accumulation told a different story. Every check ride passed, every scenario resolved, every piece of doubt addressed not by argument but by execution. She closed it and set it on the desk, the desert wind rattling faintly at the window. Tomorrow would bring another trial. She would be there to meet it. And if the whispers started again, so be it. She'd already learned the only answer worth giving was written in the sky. The dawn came thin and cold, a grey blade slicing the horizon before the sun could warm it. From the flight line, the mountains were just black teeth against a paling sky. Marina Solis stood in the shadow of Hangar 2, already zipped into her flight suit, helmet under one arm, gloves in her back pocket. She had been told today's sortie would be her final evaluation. No formal brief, no syllabus outline, just a launch window and a set of coordinates that would be disclosed in the air. Around her, The base moved with its usual precision. Tugs towing aircraft from their shelters, ground crews checking hydraulics, the dull metallic clank of ladders against fuselage, the smell of jet fuel hung in the cool air like a promise. She could feel eyes on her, the same way she had weeks ago when she first crossed into this space. Back then, it had been curiosity, doubt, even open dismissal. Now, the attention was quieter, measured, as if the watchers were waiting to see if the weeks of drills and flights had truly transformed her into someone worth counting on. Captain Rylan Hayes emerged from the operations building with his visor up and a flight plan in his hand. He walked straight toward her, handed over the folded sheet without a word. When she opened it, she found only a single line of text. "You will fly lead. Threat scenario dynamic. Live opposition." She looked up. Live opposition? He didn't blink. Graduation day. Then he moved past her toward his own aircraft. The briefest of startups, a thumbs up from the crew chief, and she was rolling out onto the taxiway. 2 other T-38s fell in behind her, numbers 2 and 3 for the sortie. The tower cleared them for immediate departure, and the trio launched in rapid sequence, climbing through the low haze until the desert floor blurred into the color of old brass. 5 minutes into the climb, AWACS cut in. "Lead. Be advised. 2 aggressors inbound from your 9 o'clock simulated hostile high-speed intercept." Her eyes flicked to the radar scope. 2 blips, closing fast. She keyed the mic. 2, 3, we go defensive left. Break on my mark. 3, 2, mark. They rolled as one, banking into the sun's glare. The first pass was nothing but a roar and a streak of motion, the aggressor jets slashing through their formation before looping out for another attack. Her training kicked in, keep the formation intact, force the attackers into predictable moves, create the opening. She called for a split maneuver, sending 2 high and 3 low while she reversed into a climbing turn. The lead aggressor followed her, just as she'd gambled, and in that moment she had him bracketed. 3 rising into his blind spot, tone in the headset, simulated missile away. The AWACS controller's voice was sharp. "Lead, splash 1. She didn't have time to celebrate. The second aggressor was pressing hard on 2's tail. She shoved the throttle forward, dropped altitude in a shallow dive to gain speed, then pulled up under 2, forcing the attacker to break off or risk collision. 2 swung wide, came around, and tagged the remaining target. Lead, splash 2. Scenario complete. RTB for Phase 2. She caught the glance from 2's canopy as they reformed. No words, but the look carried acknowledgement. Phase 2 was waiting on the ground, a systems emergency drill. They landed, taxied straight to the hot pit, and before she could even kill the engines, a maintenance crew chief climbed the ladder and handed her a card. Control surface actuator failure, immediate turnaround. She reset the seat, took the checklist in hand, and worked the problem with the ground team feeding her data. 20 minutes later, she was back in the air, climbing out over the test range with the actuator override engaged, the jet a shade heavier in her hands. At altitude, the simulated fault compounded, fuel leak, electrical instability, both tied into the same circuit. It was the kind of cascading failure that unraveled pilots who didn't prioritize fast and right. She isolated the leak first, fuel preserved, range extended, then rerouted power, cutting secondary systems to keep the flight controls steady. The aircraft's behavior changed instantly, sluggish on one axis but stable enough to bring home. When she crossed the fence on final approach, she could hear her own heartbeat over the hum in the headset. Touchdown was smooth, rollout exact. Back in the debrief room, the evaluators sat in a row, Hayes among them, Brackett at the far end. They asked about her decision tree, her fuel calculations, her choice to sacrifice certain systems. She answered in clear, precise terms, never rushing, never hedging. When the lead evaluator closed his folder, he looked down the table and nodded.
"Staff Sergeant Marina Solis, welcome to the Officer Corps.
It was Brackett who slid the insignia box across the table. He met her eyes when she picked it up, and this time there was no hesitation in the small nod he gave her. The ceremony that followed was brief, almost stark. Out on the flight line, with the sun at its highest and the sound of an F-35 climbing overhead, she stood at attention while Hayes pinned the new bars to her collar. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you've got lead next month in the joint exercise. Don't make me regret it." She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Wouldn't dream of it, Captain." That night, she walked alone to the far end of the runway where the sodium lights faded into darkness. From here, the sky was clean and sharp, the stars hung low over the desert. She thought of the first day she'd stepped into this base, the weight of the stairs, the small axe meant to push her out. Every flight, every drill, every choice had been a brick in the path that brought her here, and tomorrow that path would keep going, out beyond the edge of the runway, into the sky where nothing stayed still and nothing was given. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant rumble of another night sortie launching. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound fill her chest. Then she turned back toward the hangars. There was work to do, always. The desert night had fallen silent again. The last sortie of the day had landed an hour ago, its engines winding down like a long breath finally released. In the hangars, lights dimmed to a low amber, mechanics worked in slow, practiced motions, and somewhere beyond the flight line, the wind moved across the open sand like an unseen tide. Marina Solis stood at the edge of the tarmac, the faint smell of fuel and scorched rubber still in the air. Her new officer bars caught the light, not with the shine of decoration, but with the weight of something earned in silence. It had been a road lined with closed doors, clipped words and sideways glances, but also with hands that, against their own caution, had reached out to steady her. She thought of the first day she'd walked into this base, carrying the quiet that everyone mistook for weakness. How easy it would have been to leave when the odds stacked too high, when the jokes hit too sharp. But walking away would have left the truth unspoken. That skill didn't need permission, that worth didn't ask for a stage. Every drill, every simulated failure, every sky she had flown under had been a test. Some of those tests were written in manuals, others were carved into her by the way people watched, judged, and waited for her to trip. But the thing about waiting for someone to fail is that you forget. Some people have been living in that space all their lives. To them, survival is just another day's work. She'd learned to keep her focus where it mattered, on the checklist, on the coordinates, on the sound of the aircraft responding exactly as she asked it to. She didn't fight the storms head-on. She flew through them, adjusting trim and pitch until the turbulence became just another condition to manage. That was the lesson they didn't put in the syllabus. Now, the call sign lead was more than a role in a sortie. It was the proof that quiet persistence could write its own clearance into the sky. No ceremony could make it more real. No applause could add weight to it. It was already built into her, layered through the hours in the cockpit, the nights poring over manuals, the mornings walking onto the flight line before the sun even touched the desert floor. In the distance, the lights of the base shimmered, small against the dark. Somewhere in those buildings were the same people who had doubted her, the same ones who now flew in formation at her command. And maybe tomorrow, new pilots would arrive, wide-eyed, uncertain, carrying their own quiet. If they were lucky, they'd find a place in her flight. If they were luckier, they'd learn from her what no instructor could teach. Because this wasn't just about flying, it was about holding your course when others try to push you off it. About recognizing that every dismissal, every test, every hand trying to block your way could also be a marker showing exactly where you needed to go. So when we tell stories like Marina's, it's not just to honor what she's done. It's to remind ourselves that every runway is built by the people who refused to turn back, even when the lights went out. It's for the ones still walking, still carrying their logbooks through hangars where no one bothers to look up. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there right now, standing at the edge of your own field, hearing the low hum of the world doubting you. If so, take a moment to see what Marina saw, that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to keep moving. One check, one climb, one landing at a time. And when the moment comes, you'll know it, not because someone tells you, but because you'll feel the air clear in your chest. The way it did for her the first time she heard lead, you're cleared. We've reached the end of this story, but the sky above Redstone is still open. Somewhere another sortie is rolling down the runway, and in that cockpit is someone who doesn't yet know what they're capable of. They will. If you've watched all the way through, thank you. You're part of what keeps these stories alive, the ones that don't make headlines, that don't get written into official histories, but that change everything for the people living them. So here's what I'll ask you. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us about the time you pushed through when someone told you not to. Or tell us about the person who believed in you when no one else would. Those are the moments that build legends. And if this story spoke to you, if you felt the heat of the tarmac, the pull of the climb, the sting of doubt turning into fuel, hit the like button. Subscribe to Veteran Biker so you don't miss the next mission. Because there will always be another mission, another pilot, another runway where someone's about to prove everyone wrong. We'll be here to tell it. This is Veteran Biker. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your hands steady on the stick.